Good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Oh, hold on. Sorry, that was the doorbell, and told them sorry, busy. Oh, yes, hello everybody, and welcome here to a day where we all should end this stream amazingly pissed off. And because we are going to see and hear a bit about the state versus Virgilio Aguilar Mendez. Mr. Mendez stood on a sidewalk, minding his own business, and a cop drove up to him, started asking him, "What are you doing here?" Now, Mr. Mendez barely speaks English. He has a few words that he knows. And same with Spanish, because he is of a Maya tribe. And as such, he speaks only that tribe's language. So whatever the cops are trying to tell him, he clearly does not understand what's going on. Yes, this is the dude eating a sandwich on a sidewalk. He tries to say, "I'm eating, I'm living at the hotel," pointing at the hotel. He has no idea what's going on. And 14 minutes later, he is on the ground, beaten, tased, all of it. And I've checked with several lawyers, US-based lawyers, about this, and it's clearly unconstitutional what they did to Mr. Mendez. Oh, hi, John Gary. I want to hear all the evidence, but if it is as reported, it seems like a strong case. If a suspect dies after a lawful force was used by an officer, that officer would be tried. Here's the thing. It has to start with a lawful arrest in this case. So it's not really the same, but the other way around. Because all he did was standing on a sidewalk. That's not an offense. Speaking bad English, also not an offense. It's the officer's sole responsibility to make sure whoever who he is talking to is aware. And through that video, we saw that over at Megan Fox's channel, at least a few minutes of it. And everything that happened after he said, "Hey, who are you?" According to the lawyers I've spoken to, it's no. Just no. This is not how an arrest or a detainment or anything should happen. Not even close, according to those. We can all have different opinions, but here's the thing. If an out of shape with a prior condition police officer falls down after an in most people's opinion unlawful arrest, that the scene is already over. He is walking to his police car. Then he has a heart attack. That's natural causes. And if the arrest is deemed unlawful, it's a sad situation, but it's not Mr. Mendez' fault. And we are not watching that video of the struggle. We are watching the competency hearing from the 22nd, where the court will try to find out, is the Mr. Mendez even aware of what's going on? Yes, they really brought a case. They are charging, I don't know the exact charge, but he is charged with causing that officer's death due to the so-called struggle. And this is one of the cases where, you know, I'm doing the Young Thug trial, but they are at a pause right now. So this is one of the ones that I wanted to go into further down the line. But then this competency hearing happened. And yeah, I'm going to cover that. I also know that Dave will cover it in some shape or form. And I think Jeff will cover it in some shape or form later on. And probably Megan Fox as well. So there will be a lot of different opinions out there for you to choose from. But yeah. I'm going to have a new point. If this was an unlawful arrest, then shouldn't the other officers be the ones also charged? Just a question. Yeah. Now, yeah, but we are here for this. St. Johns County in it's St. Johns County in Florida. And so this is a Florida case. We will find out, because I've heard reports of that too, but I also heard other opinions about it. But this is the hearing, the competency hearing, where different experts and stuff like that will go, will testify about his competency, his ability to understand. So, yeah, Dave has an edited version of the body cam and hearing. Yeah. But I will see, oh, sorry, here. So, unmute, boost, and let's go.
Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of social history, he comes from an intact family. He said his parents raised him. It's not clear whether they got along well or whether he observed domestic violence. That's not clear from the interview. He has siblings, and he has a sixth grade education. He did some agricultural work, both in Guatemala and in the United States. And he might have repeated the fifth grade.
And turning to trauma history, can you describe if you're able to learn anything or if you did learn anything about trauma?
Yes. It's difficult to ask about head injuries, even for somebody with no cognitive deficits or language barriers. For him, it was nearly impossible to ask about, did you sustain a head injury? Did somebody hit you on the head? Did you hit yourself on the head? Did you lose consciousness? That question was very hard. Did you faint? So he mentioned at least 2 head injuries involving machetes from the work in agriculture. Like one, the cousin was playing and hit him in the head, and another point, he hit himself in the head. But it's not clear whether he was hospitalized or lost consciousness.
And can you describe your overall interview with Virgilio?
The interview was extremely difficult because of his difficulty understanding sentences. It would have taken hours to get a thorough history, and I'm not sure that it could have been done. So he cooperated. He tried to speak to me in Spanish, and he made errors that way, so I had to stop him and say, use the interpreter. So he indicated that he was somewhat sad, worried. He did not report any psychosis, hallucinations, suicidality.
And are there instances in the interview that you found that Virgilio was acquiescing or suggestible?
Yes. So he mostly answered yes, no matter what the question was asked of him. At some point I asked, how did your parents get along? And he said yes. So his tendency is to say yes, or yes, I understand. So for example, I would say, this is my role, this is what I'm here to do you understand? And he would say yes. Then I would say, okay, explain to me what I just said, and he couldn't explain it to me, he couldn't articulate it. So he has a tendency to acquiesce.
Now, turning to competency, what is your opinion of Virgilio's competency?
My opinion is that Mr. Aguilar Mendez is not competent to proceed to trial, and he didn't understand his Miranda rights.
And when you evaluate a patient, what are the 2 main categories that you're looking at?
So in terms of competency to proceed, we follow the Dusky standard, right? So we have to see whether the defendant has first we need to see what are the problems. Is it a mental illness, or is it a cognitive deficit, or is it an intellectual disability? And then we look at, well, does this person have the present ability, the ability now to consult with his attorney with a reasonable degree of rational understanding? And does the person has a factual as well as a rational understanding of the proceedings against him and the legal system? And whether the person made this, waive his Miranda rights in a way that was not knowledgeably, intelligently. So those are the involuntary.
Can you please explain to Judge Smith how Virgilio lacks a factual understanding of the case?
All right, so if we look at the different facets of competency, One is the capacity to appreciate his legal charges. So he didn't know the names of the legal charges, and I explained what the names were, and I explained what they were. Most important than the names is that he couldn't understand that he was being accused of manslaughter and that involved somebody dying, and he didn't understand that concept. And he would forget information after a brief delay. So he could parrot things immediately, and then within 2 minutes, he couldn't talk about it again. He had a lot of difficulty even understanding, not even using words like felony or misdemeanor, but a major crime or a minor crime, and he couldn't understand that. He does not understand the penalties. His thinking is just very concrete. So, but let me finish with the factual. So, he understands guilty and no guilty in terms of guilty means I did it, and no guilty means I didn't do it. But he couldn't understand nuance beyond that. So he couldn't understand the difference between being guilty, pleading guilty, or being found guilty. And that those are very different concepts. He couldn't understand that. He couldn't understand what the potential penalties are or the adversarial nature of the legal system. So he thinks that the role of the judge is to find out the truth. So that the judge is just gonna look at the case and say, this is true and this is not true. And that the prosecutor is someone with authority over him that he must obey, and he must do what the prosecutor wants. He had difficulty disclosing facts to the attorney in terms of what happened that day and his life in general. So those are the concerns. Usually people have factual understanding and they lack the rational, but he didn't have the factual, the most basic.
Right, and he explained to Judge Smith how Virgilio lacks a rational understanding of the criminal justice system. I think you touched on it a little bit.
Yes, so the rational understanding will be a higher bar, and that is the ability to think critically. So, for example, the concept of a plea bargain. That requires to understand hypothetical scenarios. So in this case, let's say that you're guilty, but there's no evidence. Does it make sense to plead guilty? Or let's say that you're not guilty, but there is a lot of circumstantial evidence. Does it make sense to plead guilty? And he really couldn't understand this. We spent a lot of time on plea bargaining. And at the end, he said, if I say something along the lines of, if I say I'm guilty, then I get more time, which is the opposite what a plea bargain is. So he couldn't really take things and apply it to this case. His thinking is very concrete. That means people who think in concrete ways, they are literal. And he cannot do hypotheticals, he cannot imagine as if. So that's difficult for him. That's more along the lines of abstract thinking. He cannot think critically through issues. So that's why he lacks a rational understanding of what it would mean. Most importantly, what his rights are. So we had a lot of trouble when I asked him, for example, what does it mean that you have the right to remain silent? And he said that he understood, but when I asked him to define it, he thinks the right to remain in silence means he cannot be rude to the police. That's what that right means. So it became apparent to me that he didn't have a concept of not only Miranda rights, but rights in general. And that part of that is cultural.
If, depending on how this hearing goes and subsequent hearings, there might not be a trial. We don't know. And if it is, it's far into the future. Did they check if the officer had heart disease or a family background of heart problems? I don't know. I have read some articles, but that seems to be lacking, the information. So currently I know about the what happened during the arrest. I know what happened to the officer, and I know that the prosecution wants Mr. Mendez charged for causing that heart attack due to the struggle during the, in my opinion, unlawful arrest. Mm.
But part of that I couldn't explain to him.
Now, I think you touched on this, but just to flesh this out a little further, how does Virgilio fail to consult with the attorney, myself as counsel?
So one of the things that he has difficulty, well, I asked him, what would you do in a case? How can you help your case? What is the evidence in your case? Give me a timeline of your life of that day. And he has difficulty doing all of that. So he will have difficulty tracking things, expressing information. His information at this point is unreliable. He had a lot of difficulty with numbers. He couldn't provide numbers and dates and the order of events. So that's one way in which he couldn't do that. He couldn't look at evidence and be able to challenge that evidence or help the attorney challenge that evidence. He doesn't understand how the legal system works, and what is worrisome in this case is that at some point they interpreted it as permission to teach him with her resources and with her examples. So part of what we do in an evaluation of competency is, I want to know not only what he doesn't know, but can he learn? And he couldn't learn information even when someone was explaining to him in different ways.
And is that an example of
He was charged because the community and the police force put pressure on the prosecution. That's my interpretation on what happened from about. Well, Mr. Mendez has been under arrest since that day, since that happened. And I believe the original charges was actual murder, but now it's down to manslaughter. Yeah, you are all as confused as I am about this. Here's the thing, John Gary. Mr. Mendez is brought up in a Mayan tribe. He grew up in a Mayan tribe. He knows a few words in English, and he knows sentences in Spanish. That's about it, according to the information I have. And this lady has conducted several interviews with Mr. Mendez. Now, we can all grade how much we believe her, but we still have to accept her opinion somewhat, in some shape or form. He stood on a sidewalk eating a sandwich. That's the extent. And there might have been a phone call that said there's somebody walking around. That's not a crime. And now, they later found out that he was in the United States illegally. And but nothing of that was known when the arrest and struggle happened. None of it. I think Dave will do a stream about the actual struggle. Yeah, he's doing one at 6 p.m. US Eastern. So you will find out more from Dave about it, because Dave is one of the people I've talked to, and he is a criminal defense lawyer. So you will get better understanding about the basic facts of law from him. I want to hear this competency hearing because this is more related to my kind of work in labor law, and because sometimes here in Sweden we get situations with people who doesn't speak Swedish. So I do have a basic knowledge about this, and I will try to guide you through this. But most of all, I want to listen and hear and make it. It might be, I don't know, I haven't watched this at all. It might be that at the end of this, I'm on the side of the police. I I don't think so, but I will have that opening for myself. Let's continue.
Kind of what you're saying about the thinking is concrete, because a lot of plea bargaining and these issues of not guilty versus guilty are more nuanced, and he's not able to really understand that because his thinking is, as you said, it's literal.
Yeah, his thinking is literal. If I didn't kill somebody, then I'm not guilty. And if I'm not guilty, there's no way a judge can find me guilty because I didn't do it. And he doesn't understand that there is a difference between feeling I'm not guilty and pleading not guilty, which is different because you could be not guilty and plead guilty or vice versa. And what that means, or you could be found guilty by the court. So he doesn't understand those concepts. That's very hard. He doesn't understand the concept of right, which should be easier than plea bargaining. Plea bargaining is one of those concepts that is very hard to understand.
All right, so you're saying rights in terms of legal rights. How is that a nuanced thing that he's not? I would think, is that not a concrete issue, or why is it not for him?
I think it's both, because I can understand, okay, I was born and raised in a country, in Cuba, where people don't have many rights. But I come here and I understand that in America people have a lot of rights, and I immediately understand that. And he was not able to understand the concept of rights. And there is something beyond the cultural issue with him, because I have worked with individuals who understand things or can learn things at least.
Right, meaning it's not just a culture, because you just gave an example of coming to this country and learning.
Yes.
The issue, right?
Yes.
Because
yes.
really it's not just culture, there's more going on.
Yes, so my opinion is that individuals of Mayan descent can learn, and their intelligence level, when we find ways to capture that scientifically, but I have talked to people who seem like genius, talk like genius, understand things, and people who don't understand much. So my guess is that there will be a variety of IQ and cognitive resources. So beyond the culture, beyond the barrier, he couldn't understand things that were simple.
All right, so you're now, for example, then, you're looking to your past examples of working with man-speaking individuals, and they were able to learn because you were teaching in the hospital.
Yes.
And come along with the confidence.
That's up to the
Yes,
judge.
and I was
After all the
able,
testimony.
with some individuals of Mayan descent, they were able to acquire the language fast. I was able to, with two of them, I communicated in Spanish, even though they spoke Man, but they were proficient enough for me to be able to communicate in Spanish, and with one I needed an interpreter.
And are you having an experience when you spoke to Virgilio?
With Virgilio, it was very difficult because I tried to simplify my language, explain things very slowly, very simply, put different examples, have the one interpreter put her examples. I even looked at how the legal system works in Guatemala. He lives in a little village where there's no police presence, but there is a council of people in the community that judge people, and he wasn't able to understand, well, this is similar to what a judge would do or what a jury would do. He couldn't understand those concepts.
We'll have to wait and see. There will be a lot of expert testimony here.
In your evaluation or interview?
No. So when individuals malinger, they are making up symptoms or they are exaggerating symptoms. So he said he denied being depressed, being anxious. He didn't want to seem unintelligent. He said, I understand things. So he was eager to say, I understand. He tried to explain things. So that's different to somebody saying, I am so depressed, I cannot understand anything, I'm hearing voices, that flamboyant presentation, that's the opposite of what he did. He wanted to be careful, he didn't want to guess things, he wanted to try his hardest.
Now, why do you suspect that there are neurological issues for Aguilar Mendez?
Yes, so the difficulty retaining information, memorizing things, the difficulty learning, despite multiple attempts to explain it in very concrete language with parables. He still had a lot of difficulty learning. The communication, well, when he communicates in Spanish, his language is very telegraphic. He makes grammatical errors. He speaks broken Spanish. But even when I spoke with him through the interpreter, he would provide me answers on questions I was not asking in a very concrete way. His language was simple, and he just couldn't learn.
What is your recommendation for overrun adjustment clinic?
So when I first saw him, and I mentioned in my report, okay, so I mentioned in my report that he appears psychiatric, he's stable psychologically. However, the type of competency restoration services he requires may be better provided in a forensic hospital. At the time I wrote my report, I thought there are no other places that offer this kind of restoration services. So even though the main idea of going to a state forensic hospital is because the person needs medications because they're so unstable and they can be compelled to get medication there. After I spoke to Mariana Blanco from the Guatemalan Maya Center, she indicated to me that that her center, which is a non-for-profit organization, has a lot of resources that can help him get competency restoration in an outpatient basis. So she explained to me that they will transport him or go to him, it doesn't matter where he is in the state, that they will provide translation services either in person or through Zoom, that they will provide medical treatment, that they will provide education. So it seems like that they have a wealth of resources. And in that case, if those resources are available, he doesn't need the intensity of a forensic hospital because he doesn't seem to be in danger and he's not psychiatrically unstable. And I also had mentioned the developmental disabilities defendant program. That could be an option. It's going to be difficult because to my knowledge, and I'm not a neuropsychologist, but to my knowledge, there's no instruments to capture his intellectual disability, but I defer that to a neuropsychologist.
So what did you learn then, or sense about the Mayan culture that you didn't know at the time of the evaluation?
Well, according to my training, in terms of competency, I know that we need to make sure that the person has the rational understanding. So it doesn't matter if they say, yes, 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 I understand. As in the interrogation video, he could say, yes, 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 but he never recited the rights, he never articulated them. So I repeated the questions over and over again at different points in the evaluation. I have come to learn that that's what typically is done with individuals of this culture. Because they don't understand the questions, it's helpful to repeat the same question over time because it might change. The other thing is about the way the story comes for them. They need to be helped in construct that story. So for example, if he says something like, I fell from the bed, he's not saying who pushed him from the bed. So, okay, were you pushed from the bed or did somebody push you? Somebody pushed me. Was your mom there or was your father there? So it's very difficult to obtain that story and that requires a lot of checking in with the person. And acknowledging a tendency to acquiesce, which is why when I realized he was saying yes to everything, I asked him, how do your parents get along? And he said, yes. So taking that into account is very important to check in with them, to make sure they understand, to maybe do several sessions, and to have a Mayan interpreter.
Is he restorable?
That's questionable. So I wouldn't say he's not restorable because we haven't tried, right? So I cannot sit here and say, well, he's not restorable. But to me, it's questionable because he didn't show any signs of being able to learn. So I say my recommendation would be to try to restore him and see if maybe one-on-one competency assessment with language appropriate services, if he can benefit from those.
Now, after your review of Dr. Leon and Dr. Davis' report, were their opinions consistent with yours?
Well, I think when I read Dr. Leon's report, it struck me how similar to my experience it was. It was very consistent with the things. I think one of the things she said, she opined that he could be able to behave in court. And I said, no, but I agree with her. He's able to behave in court in the sense that he will not interrupt, he's not aggressive, he's not violent. But my concern about being in court is that he will not be able to track and consult with his attorney. So that's why I put an acceptable in that part. So I'm looking at that question in a broader term. But the same language issues, the same cognitive problems, Dr. Leon's assessment was consistent with me. Dr. Davis is consistent with me in the sense that none of those capacities, the capacity to testify, and knowing what he charges, knowing the penalties, he was not able to say any of that to Dr. Davis. It's just that Dr. Davis arrived at the conclusion that effort might be suspect, because he couldn't learn, he refused to guess, things that could be explained, in my opinion, by other things, but he didn't demonstrate those capacities with Dr. Davis neither.
One moment. Would there be other explanations for why my client performed poorly beyond malingering with Dr. Davis?
In my opinion, he provides information that is inconsistent, and that could be explained by a lack of understanding of things. So if I ask him, what is guilty means, guilty is I did it, well, maybe that's not a great example, but for example, his educational level. So he will say that he made it to 6th grade, but later he said that he went 2 years to school. He has a lot of difficulty with numbers. Also, he doesn't like to guess because it's almost like a sign of being disrespectful, and they really defer to authority and acquiesce. So depending on the question and the way you ask the question, he might agree with you and he might acquiesce to things. So that is one thing that I think is different. So if you ask him to articulate, that's when you will realize that he has a lot of trouble.
And I think you touched on this in my last question, Your Honor, but just in terms of your experience with the MAN community, that would be both in the criminal and the immigration court. So it's not just in the criminal setting.
Yes, it's mostly actually immigration courts. So seeing individuals who were separated from their parents while crossing the border, or individuals seeking asylum or looking at risk for them. And like I said, there is a distinction between the cognitive issues that I see and just cultural barrier. And also, beyond the culture, there is that idea of what we call the clock of competence. That individuals with intellectual disabilities want to appear smart and they don't want to be intellectually disabled. So they will say things like, yes, I understand. Or they will say, yes, sure, I play chess, I'm very smart. But then if you ask him what positions do you like, what are your favorite pieces, he will not be able to articulate them. So there's that desire to.
So let me follow up with that point then, because you, and I'll just.
Sorry, muted. I would assume it's a bit the same as here in Europe, where refugees or workers from Eastern Europe or outside of the European Union, they pay a smuggler to take them from point A to point B. And that could be directly off the border into the European Union or all the way up to Sweden. So I would assume, I don't know those facts, how he actually got to the United States, only that at 17 he took himself or via a smuggler to the United States from Guatemala.
Bring you right to it. There was a point in one of the video clips of, I think I shared with Alves, where the roommate said that he doesn't speak Spanish. But my client then told in the interview that yes, he can communicate with Spanish. Would that be an example of someone being ID, trying to mask what their abilities are?
So someone with an intellectual disability could say, yes, I speak Spanish. That was my experience with him, that he said, yes, I understand what you're saying when I spoke Spanish, and I would say, tell me what I'm saying, and he couldn't do it. So yes, he says he understands, he speaks Spanish, but somebody else might be a better judge.
I sent Jeff an invite, but he has his own stream right now. So maybe he can explain that if he chooses to show up.
Cross-examination. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
I have a question for you.
He's a doctor.
Much. You indicated earlier in your testimony that you received a copy of the recorded interview that Detective Mendez did with the defendant in this case, correct?
Yes.
And I think you also received a transcript of that, correct?
Yes.
Isn't it true that Detective Mendez, who speaks Spanish, was able to converse with the defendant during an interview for about an hour?
In my opinion, they communicated, but they seem to be having parallel conversations. I think Virgilio was very suggestible, and he would adopt the things that the detective said, but he didn't come up with things himself.
For the entirety of that conversation?
I reviewed the part of the Miranda waiver. So up until the transcript, that's what I reviewed, all the beginning of the evaluation.
Okay, so let me just clarify some things here. Are you saying you only reviewed the portion up through the Miranda warnings?
Well, there is, so he talks to him, offers him a drink, they talk about the Miranda, but then he gets some background information as well. Where were you born, and things like that. And he also talked about what happened actually in that part of the interview.
Okay, so let me ask you a little bit more. Did you watch the whole thing?
I didn't watch the whole hour, no. I watched the first, up until he talked about what happened that day.
Can you explain, because you said that, and what I really want to drill down is I understand your total opinion here, your overall opinion. I know that the law or the statutes require you to kind of say what it is. What's the reason for the deficits here? My understanding of what you testified here today is not so much a mental illness or psychological issue, but an intellectual issue. Is that correct?
Yes, I was not able to, in depth, I cannot sit here and say he doesn't have depression and anxiety. I cannot say that because it was so difficult to communicate with him, and depression and anxiety are concepts that require abstract thinking. So I'm not ruling that out, but what was glaring to me was the cognitive or intellectual issues that I saw in him, and that would be, for now, the basis of incompetency, in my opinion.
And as a doctor psychologist who does this quite a bit, you understand there's sort of two tracks when it comes to competency. There's the intellectual disability as well as the mental illness. I mean, Department of Children and Families has jurisdiction over one issue, and the Agency for Persons with Disabilities has the jurisdiction of the other issue. You understand that, right?
Yes.
And so under which track would this fall under?
Well, that's the difficult part, because I don't think I was able to conduct a full assessment of Virgilio. In 2 hours, it was extremely difficult to get through these concepts. So I observed intellectual issues, difficulty learning, difficulty with memory. I don't know, because I'm not a neuropsychologist, and I don't know if there are instruments that could assess his level of intellectual functioning.
Be in the courtroom.
For example, to look at neurocognitive disorders, I would need to know what was his functioning before the accident or whatever acquired injury he has, and what is the functioning later. So I cannot make those assessments. So my understanding is that he has difficulties, but I cannot name them because that would require a neuropsychological evaluation.
Okay, so is there anything other than a neuropsychological evaluation that the court would need in order to make a determination as to which track Mr. Aguilar Mendez would fall under?
Well, I think observation. So if we place him in a program where he is being evaluated, we will be able to know, regardless of the deficits, whether he can learn. If we give him that time to learn information.
And he can do that in a secure setting?
He could do that outpatient or secure setting, whoever can offer the services.
You understand it would pretty much almost have to be a secure setting, because there, even if, say, for example, the court were to allow him there's an INS, there's an immigration hold on him, so we wouldn't be able to release him to the community. You understand that?
Yeah, I don't understand the legal ramifications as to whether he could be placed in one or the other. I think just clinically speaking, he can benefit from outpatient services. That's what I'm saying.
Nothing further.
Redirect.
Nothing further.
Ms. Stevens?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Virgilio?
Thank you.
Stevens, can you call your next witness?
Yes, sir. Defense cause Dr. Your Honor, defense cause Dr. Yolanda Leon.
All right. There we go. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All right, go ahead and have a seat in the witness stand and sit with your record voice in the mic.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Counsel, your witness.
Thank you. Please state your name to Judge Smith.
Good morning, Dr. Yolanda C. Leon.
And what is your profession?
I'm a neuropsychologist, clinical and forensic. I'm a clinical psychologist and a former school psychologist.
And are you licensed to practice in the state of Florida?
I am.
How long?
I've been licensed since 1997, and I've been practicing since 1986, formerly as a school psychologist, and then as a trainee, intern and resident.
And what is your current employment?
My current what?
Your current job title, your current employment?
I'm a neuropsychologist at the USF Morsani College of Medicine. I'm an assistant professor, and I'm the co-director of training for our neuropsychology fellowship program.
And can you describe the work that you do within that fellowship training program?
In the fellowship training program, I help design the training rotations for doctors who are doing a 2-year fellowship in neuropsychology in preparation for board certification. We schedule the didactic trainings that involves bringing in speakers on different topics. We do supervision. We arrange for them to see patients clinically as the main doctor that sees them, where we are the attending that supervises them and signs off and is legally responsible for the ultimate report under a training setting. So we teach and we supervise.
Now, as part of the work that you do as a director, include consulting other professionals? Or let me rephrase that, do other neuropsych teams actually come to consult with your program?
Other neuropsych teams sometimes will consult with our program. We mostly serve as a consultative service for neurosurgery and neurology, although we serve all of the specialties in the College of Medicine and in the community.
Now, what court-related assessments have you done over the years?
I've done court-appointed assessments for competency, sanity, ability to waive Miranda, mitigation, juvenile resentencing, sexually violent risk assessments, violence risk assessments, and Jimmy Rice evaluations.
Now, how many times have you evaluated a patient for competency to stand trial?
Several hundred times.
And in the past, you retained your services?
Different courts throughout the state where I've been on the circuit and I've been court ordered. I've been retained by the defense and I've been retained by the prosecution.
And you've testified previously within your specialty of neuropsychology in the state of Florida?
Yes, ma'am.
And that would be state and federal courts?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, turning specifically to this case, what were you asked to do?
I was asked to assess Mr. Virgilio Mendez Aguilar for competency and to determine whether or not he had some sort of neurodevelopmental disorder. I think the order literally said mental retardation, now known as intellectual disability.
And what
The court, in the court order, they said retard. Whoever runs this court with the orders, it's time to update your language a bit. And when I say a bit, I mean a lot. Let's go on. But finally, we have. I don't know the name of the first witness, but this is the neuropsychologist, Dr. Yolanda C. Leon, and let's see what she has to say.
did you review prior to your interview of my client, Virgilio Aguilar Mendez?
I didn't review any prior to my first interview that I did by Zoom, but after I met with him, I read the reports of Dr. Davis and Dr. Castillo. I read the charging documents, and after his evaluation, I viewed the transcript of his interview with the detectives. And I spoke with his mother through a mom interpreter and the staff at the Mayan Center. I believe Miss Blanco is her name. And I think that's it.
And why did you interview Virgilio the second time? Meaning there's that first time on Zoom. What was it that brought you to see him in person the second time?
Zoom is a great way to conduct an assessment when the person is not impaired in some way. During COVID, obviously, we had to do many evaluations that way, but now we're not in that situation. And I quickly surmised that he's not Spanish dominant and that he's mom dominant. But there was something not quite right about him that I knew I wouldn't be able to assess on video. His thinking was very concrete. I wasn't sure if his appearance was typical Mayan or he had some dysmorphias, and I can't appreciate that. Dysmorphias meaning unusual features often associated with some sort of genetic disorder, and that can be associated with a neurodevelopmental disorder. So I believe I alerted you to those concerns, and we talked about me seeing him in person to do a more comprehensive assessment of his language-related functioning and his intellect.
So for that more comprehensive evaluation for his cognitive abilities then and language-related issues, when was that?
I believe it was on the 30th of September.
And who was present?
You were present. I was present, and although in the background, I believe there was a deputy present just outside the door.
And was there an interpreter present for that evaluation?
There was a mom interpreter present by Zoom or video. I think we had audio.
Did you prepare a report after those evaluations, or those interviews then?
I did.
Now, if I turn and focus in on the neuropsychological, neurocognitive testing, when you assess a patient for competency, what exactly is it that you're testing or assessing?
I'm assessing the statutory requirements, which are exactly those that Dr. Castillo listed. And when I'm evaluating him from a neuropsychological perspective, I'm interested in his overall presentation, his language, his thinking, and looking to see if there's any indicators of some sort of brain dysfunction that could impact his competency status.
And if you look to ID issues, what do you evaluate or test for with intellectual disability issues?
With intellectual disability issues, we look at his overall level of cognitive functioning, his IQ, or his horsepower, or bandwidth is a more modern term, if you will, in terms of intellect, intelligence. And we also look at adaptive abilities, that is activities of daily living, the individual's ability to get by in the world, to survive and function in the world. And also we look at, in adults, instrumental activities of daily living, which are part of adaptive abilities. Those are the higher level abilities, like being able to manage one's finances or medication, or make legal decisions or important medical decisions for themselves without the assistance of others. The DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, that is the code of criteria for making a diagnosis for another or not, requires that to make a diagnosis of intellectual disability, the individual must have deficits in adaptive behavior, activities of daily living. So that's an area that we look at.
And then in a neurocognitive screen, if you've already answered it, that's fine, but what do you test with a neurocognitive screen?
With a neurocognitive screening, we're looking for some sort of physical evidence that something is amiss with brain functioning. In the case of a mom, where their language is so vastly different from that of ours, and where clearly I'm not proficient and most evaluators are not proficient, we can't rely on language alone to be able to make an assessment of their brain functioning. And there are no standardized tests in mom, and no mom neuropsychologist that I'm aware of in the United States, or maybe even in Guatemala, that can actually do a measure of neurocognitive testing. But when you look at sensory perceptual abilities, they will give you a physical cue or clue, if you will, as to whether something may be wrong with that person's brain functioning. So we do a screening to see if there's any of those indicators.
And then in terms of the actual neuropsychological testing for my client, I understand what you just said, that there's no specific to mom or formulated directly within his language, but were you able to do any neuropsychological testing for my client?
I was not able to do testing, but I was able to do screening.
And what were the results of your screening?
Well, the results of the screening support that there is something wrong with his brain functioning.
And what were you able to determine about the issues with his brain functioning?
One of the things that we assess is his eye movements and his eye functioning. We look at his eyes and how they move and how they work, and what he can report seeing or not seeing under certain circumstances. One very apparent and obvious sign is he has his left eye turns slightly inward. That's a left inward strabismus. That could happen because of brain dysfunction. It can also happen because of a problem with the muscles of the eye, and it can just be a lazy eye. It could be corrected, but those are much fewer cases than that of some sort of injury to his central nervous system. In addition to that, when we look at his visual fields, he has a deficit in the bottom left side on both eyes. That's a very consistent sort of pattern that most individuals would never be able to come up with if they wanted to appear impaired. but it definitely is consistent with some sort of dysfunction. It's only the lower quadrant, so we call it an inferior quadrant synopsia, and it probably indicates that there's something wrong with this parietal pathway of the nervous system. So that's another indicator that something's wrong.
And, oh, go ahead.
So then we do a frontal system screening, which is a battery of tests. Most people call it the Luria frontal systems screening, and it involves commands and asking them to do things. Now, at this point, we had the Mon translator.
These are all, as she explains, are indicators through her screening process. So indicators are not evidence in itself. As you said, there are indicators, but when they pile up, the indicators, there might be something there that makes him intellectually challenged due to either injury or just genealogy. We don't know. I hope she gets through that, or another witness will go through that.
The Mon interpreter, and I asked him if he understood this Mon interpreter, if she seemed like the same dialect of his village. I agree with everything that Dr. Castillo said, and it's very difficult to know what he understands and what he doesn't. But given that she asked him, I'm taking that that's the closest we can get to him understanding as we're going to get. And his answer was very interesting. He said he did understand her better than the previous one. I don't know who the previous one was or on which occasion he was talking about, because he has difficulty with sequencing. Getting him to tell me a sequence is very, very difficult. He doesn't seem to have that ability, or it's an ability that's deficient. So when I ask him to do certain commands, because sometimes when you have a certain type of brain dysfunction, brain injury, from head injury or seizures or a stroke or an encephalitis, anything that he could have had that I have no way of knowing, you can see them do poorly on these types of motor movements. And on one of them, we did it twice and he came up with the same wrong response. So given the cultural differences, the language differences, that we were working through an interpreter, and given that I can't count on what he actually understands or doesn't understand, I have to take all of that into consideration. But the fact remains that he was consistent in the type of error. And when you put that together with the quadrant synopsia on his lower left quadrant, his left eye turning inward, and his inability to do complex motor movements, even when I demonstrated them for him, supports that something is not right with the central nervous system.
Right, so then that, the central nervous system, and that's indicative of some form of brain damage.
I think he has some sort of brain damage, yes.
I see her believable,
Now, if you
but
had
there are
seen
still just
Mr.
indicators,
Aguilar Mendez in
and I
the
think
clinical records,
courts
what would you
need
recommend
more
some of
than
the
that.
evidence? And if you had called that a clinical interview, what would you recommend?
In a clinical setting, my differential diagnosis would be, is this neurodevelopmental? In other words, did he come to the world this way, or did he suffer an insult as an infant or a child, or even prenatally or during birth, that resulted in this injury to his brain? Or did it come afterward, in which case it would be a neurocognitive
I
disorder?
think it's a
In
court
either
ordered
case,
witness in this
without more
case.
information that we can't get at in a neuropsychological test battery because of the language and cultural differences, I would be referring him for an MRI of his brain, and I would be referring him probably for an EEG, because there's a question of whether or not he has or hasn't had some sort of episodes that may be seizures in the past.
Now, your role in this case was it was not to provide a clinical diagnosis, correct?
It was not, and I'm sorry, I would also refer him directly to neurology. I would order the test ahead of that so that by the time he saw the neurologist would already have those results.
Now, based on your training and your education and your expertise in both as a neuropsychologist, what's your opinion of my client, Aguilar Mendez?
He has either a neurodevelopmental disorder, and I believe it's intellectual disability because of his concrete thinking and his impaired adaptive abilities. And I believe that it may be the result of.
I saw this earlier. Here's the thing. In the competency hearing, if they conclude he was unable to understand his Miranda rights, that he was unable to understand what the officers was telling him, that would also indicate that the cops did not do a good enough job explaining what was going on to him, which in that case also explains why the struggle and all that surrounded it. So in the back end of this, the defense can use it to make a motion for release due to an unlawful arrest. So that is one of the things they can use via this. That's my interpretation, at least.
Some insult that came early in his childhood but was made worse by possible head injuries with a machete story that is unclear. There was a potential accident where he was struck by a car, fell to the ground, and declined to go to a hospital, which I understand from my experience with the Mayan culture. They are afraid to go to our Western doctors, our typical Western medical doctors. They will often opt for the homeopathic curers or healers in their culture. So it could be one or both, but my conclusion is that there's something neurologically wrong with him. He definitely has a significant neurocognitive impairment, whatever the etiology, and he does not meet the statutory criteria to be competent, and he definitely did not understand any of the Miranda interview.
Now, earlier, you were present for Dr. Castillo explaining that when it comes to issues of nuance, that he has difficulties. Is this part of your results or your test results that would support, or does that support your test results, that nuance is difficult for him, that he has to rely on short, concrete issues?
100%. And it not only has to be concrete, and this is again beyond his Mayan language or his dialect or his language variant. I worked with probably upwards of 50.
It's the same all over the world. Money. Make money, have a better life. And a lot of people in the United States also do the holistic bullshit. So so it's not a developing country kind of problem, since you have a lot of people in the Western world who also has this holistic and swirled water bullshit snake oil. So it's not, maybe it's more common in the Mayan tribes, but we have these people in the West too.
50 to 75 mom in both clinical, criminal, and civil settings, and they don't show this level of deficit or dysfunction, with the exception of a couple of carbon monoxide poisoned individuals that were mom that I saw in a civil suit, but they were proficient in Spanish, and I was able to do their full assessment in Spanish. But they weren't this impaired. They had some memory problems as a result of the carbon monoxide poisoning.
That too.
That insult that they were not like this gentleman who appears to have a developmental delay. So I think that if we look beyond the language and the culture, yes, he's very concrete. I also think he may have some problems with his hippocampi, the part of our brain and our temporal lobe that is responsible for forming new memories, not just memory functioning, but specifically forming new memories. And that's why we can ask him something or instruct him and say, we call this pen, and this is a blue pen, and this is a red pen. And he'll repeat it, but then 7 minutes later, it's probably gone. And I believe if I were able to test him using my instruments, I would probably be able to demonstrate that psychometrically and scientifically. We can't do it because we don't have the instruments in his language. But it all holds together. The whole picture holds together.
You touched on it a moment ago regarding the trauma history. Was that part of why there's a sequencing problem in terms of his ability to tell a story from start to finish?
Any of those etiologies or causes could result in that. If he came to the world with intellectual disability, or he's one of the many thousand Hmong children that were probably exposed to carbon monoxide. There was a landmark study where they looked at about 1,300 kids and I think 1,300 controls outside of that area of Guatemala where they use those stoves, and there was a correlation between the amount of time that the mothers 32 miles from where he grew up is where they did the study. So it's the same culture, the same type of cooking. There was a correlation between the number of hours they spent in front of the stove and the amount of delay. These were Spanish-speaking kids. They took kids that had learned Spanish in school, so they were able to use nonverbal, what the study calls nonverbal and culturally adapted measures. So it sounds like, looking at it, most of the measures were visual memory and nonverbal. And they found that there was a correlation between the number of hours the kids were being held by the mom in front of the stove and the level of impairment as measured by these adapted measures. So it could be that he could have been exposed to carbon monoxide during his early childhood. It could be that he was hidden.
Yeah, but I have to agree somewhat with John Gary. If he has all these problems, all these functional problems, how did he get to the United States? Because it's a huge journey, and if he has short-time memory loss of some sort, how did he get here even through smugglers? So I believe her through her the limitations of her assessment. I believe her, she's believable, but it still doesn't explain how he could hold down a job, how he got to the United States, how he could live with others. It doesn't really explain that. But all of this, also we have to go into, was the initial arrest lawful? Yeah, I agree. She more credible than the last witness, but we missed the first couple of minutes on that one, so I'm out of that. But she's believable. She is. But as John said earlier, how did he get here? How could he function? Not here, as in, how did he get to the United States? How could he hold on to a job with all these alleged disabilities? Because even in the most basic of the normal illegal alien work, you still have to function somewhat. And that is probably what speaks against their findings. Yeah, and according to her, he had no concept of the Miranda rights.
Head when he was a child, or he fell, or he may have had high fever that was some sort of a viral infection that impacted his brain. Or it could be the car that hit him here in the United States when he refused to go to the hospital. He may have had a concussion. I have no way of knowing any of those could have caused everything that I'm seeing on my examination.
Can you explain to Judge Smith, and I'm going to bring you back to a few final questions about competency, how he lacks an understanding of the criminal justice system?
It's exactly as Dr. Castillo said. He doesn't have the ability to appreciate, to have a rational understanding of something. We have to appreciate everything that's involved in that topic, whatever it is. I'm still not clear that he has the ability to understand the concept of rights. Other moms do. I've evaluated dozens of moms for competency, and they do understand rights. Eventually they get it if they're taught in either Spanish, if they're proficient, or in some other way. He doesn't seem to understand that. When I asked his mother to tell me how she would describe rights, she could not. So I don't know if there's a family history of delays, or it's their region or their culture, but other mom can understand rights. He can't appreciate or think abstractly. He can't do a cost-benefit analysis. Well, if my lawyer recommends this, but that's going to result in that, maybe I better go with the previous option. He doesn't have the ability to think that way because he can't sequence, he can't abstract. He certainly doesn't understand higher level vocabulary. And then so much is lost in the translation that it seems almost an impossible task to be able to get him to a place of being what we call restored. I don't think he has the intellectual capacity.
And what examples then, but it sounds like from what you're describing, he's also then has a failure to consult with counsel, he would be able to do that.
I observed that he wasn't able to do that when you and I were trying to get the questions answered.
And in terms of your review of the interview with Detective Mendez and the client, did you see examples in there of intent?
I did.
And what were?
Sorry, muted. Yeah, it was in the first or in the original charges against him regarding this death. I do believe it was up to a murder charge, but it since has gone down to manslaughter, which is weird because it's still weird to me that he is charged with a crime of causing someone's heart attack due to him resisting the arrest. Yeah, and if they conclude that it is an unlawful arrest, everything here is a waste of time and money, and he would have been deported long ago. So the end result will be either he will spend time in a psychiatric ward, he will spend time in prison, or he will be deported. That's the three options that's out there. And if the prosecution chooses, they could just say, okay, deport him. He had no responsibility for this heart attack. But the prosecution chooses not to.
May I have just a moment to pull them up? Thank you. So going by the transcript, unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear it. I think I would have appreciated it much more had I been able to hear how the detective spoke and inflected and whatnot. But there's a couple of examples that I think are crucial. So at one point, the detective says, those are the rights that a person has when they are going to be asked questions about a crime that there has been. And Mr. Aguilar says, aha. He said aha to almost everything, which to me means absolutely nothing. It's just a response, but I don't believe that it indicates understanding. So then the detective goes on and says that the person was envuelta is the word. And I think that the translation said
less than a year, I
involved
think.
in. But envuelta literally means wrapped up, like you wrap a Christmas gift or a birthday present. So that's just going from English to Spanish, which he is not proficient in. And then that's a figurative, it's a figure of speech. If he had said involved in, then he said wrapped up in. It's very, for someone concrete, I don't know how he could have possibly understood that. Then there was this example where the detective says, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be, anything that you say can be used in a court, in a juzgado is the word he used, a hearing or a trial or a judgment thing or something, if you want to think of it that way. He used the word a court of law, a juzgado de leyes, or any other proceedings. Do you understand? And he said, yes. When I was doing my competency assessment, I think I had a similar experience to what I heard Dr. Castillo describe. I asked him if he understood what a juicio was, a hearing or a trial. He did not. I said, tribunal, and he did not. And I asked him to tell me, I used several words that you could use for a hearing or a trial. I did not use juzgado. And he said, I asked him, what happens in your village when someone commits a crime? How does that get handled? This is through the mom interpreter, the second interview. And he explained how there's what we have here. He said, there's like a council of elders, and then you go in front of them and you explain that you didn't mean to do it, and then they decide. It's the same answer he gave when I asked the judge's role. He decides, but he couldn't tell me what you decide, or how you decide, or what evidence is. So, again, if you look at the translation in writing, it looks like he was tracking, but there's no tracking going on here whatsoever. Here's my last example. This is
This is a competency hearing, and the video of the actual the arrest is on Dave's channel, Making Law Simple Network, MLS. So he will go through more of this at his channel at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So we will go through more of this. Let's continue.
probably the most frightening one. He says, let's continue. If you, he tells him, if you desire an attorney and don't have the money to employ one, the court will apportion one, and you have the right to follow the advice of that attorney and have them present during the questions. Do you understand? And of course he says, aha. But when you read the translation on the transcript, it says, this is what it says. We continue here. If you want an attorney and you don't have the money to hire one, the court will provide you with one. The detective didn't use the word provide. And he used the future tense of appoint or apportion. It's very confusing. From English to Spanish, it's a nightmare. I can only imagine what that translation would be like if we were to try to do it in a language that he can understand or should be able to understand. And of course, I think he doesn't, because I don't think he has that level of vocabulary.
Meaning his education level that he received in Guatemala, the 6th grade, and the Spanish that he can use or communicate. Is it fair to say that the education level or the Spanish level is so rudimentary or low that those words that were being used are above his level of Spanish, and they're including nuances that he can't understand?
Both, yes. Now, my understanding is, even though he has a 6th grade education, my understanding was that he attended school for only 2 years. So the educational system is different there. He also doesn't seem to have gone to one of the schools where they teach Spanish. He went to a local school, a Mayan school. So he would have very limited education. The deficits that I'm seeing are irrespective of level of education. I've evaluated many moms with his minimal level of education, that they have average level intellectual ability, and they can reason, and they can articulate what they're thinking, and they can sequence, and they can appreciate. He cannot.
And in terms of sequencing, did you also see an issue with his use of numbers?
Yes, and I don't know how much of that is, again, because I can't test him, because of his low level of intellectual ability, because of a math deficit, because of vocabulary and receptive language, or his concreteness, or his neurodevelopmental deficit, or his ability to retain the numbers in his head long enough to remember whether it was 2 months or this many miles from Immokalee to wherever he went, that type of thing.
What is your recommendation to the court for my comment?
My recommendation for the court is to understand that he doesn't meet the statutory criteria to be found competent, and he has no ability to appreciate Miranda. I don't know that he's going to be taught, but I agree with Dr. Castillo. We haven't had the opportunity to teach him and observe him and assess him along the way. I think that opportunity would be an important opportunity not to deny him. And I think that at some point, somebody should send him to a neurologist and get some of those imaging and EEG studies done.
And that would include, well, let me rephrase this. Is it your opinion that there's a possibility that he's restored? Or you need an opportunity to review to see if he is?
My opinion at this point is, if I'm correct and he has intellectual disability, in addition to the cultural and language differences, I don't see how we could get him to a competency status.
Oh my God. And in your evaluation, or after your evaluation, did you have an opportunity to review, you talked about the reports of Dr. Castillo, but you also saw the report of Dr. Davis?
I did.
And in Dr. Davis' report, he had mentioned that the client is malingering. Did you find my client malingering?
I did not.
Is there other reasons why the interview with Davis had gone the way it did beyond malingering?
Can you be more specific?
So in terms of, I believe that Davis had repeated instructions on the composition of the courtroom, for example, the roles of the judge, the attorney, defense counsel. And with that repetition, Dr. Davis came to the part of the reason he's saying malingering, and maybe using a wrong example, but that he's repeating the questions and he's not putting his best effort to answer them.
I think that the reason that that was happening was because of whatever deficits he has, neurodevelopmental or neurocognitive. And I think that Dr. Davis may not have had that history or recognized it. I don't think he refused to guess. I think he doesn't have the ability to understand that he's being asked to make a guess when he's asked some of the questions. And I think that the repetition is just part of whatever deficit it is that he has, that we see in the interview with the detective, where he repeatedly says, in the affirmative, and really there's no understanding there. I think Dr. Davis, my understanding of what was in the report was that he kind of ruled out the possibility of seizures, and he said in the report something to the effect that
He's currently 18 years old, I think.
Didn't know what said, he didn't know what.
Yeah, and he's 18 years old. He is 5'4". At the time of the arrest was 115 pounds, and 5 or 6 officers allegedly couldn't control him, even though they had him in cuffs, tazed, knee on back, knee on neck. That says to me out of shape officers, and one of them was so out of shape after this arrest struggle, he had a heart attack, in my opinion.
Seizures meant. And Dr. Davis, through the interpreter, told him it means rolling around on the floor.
There is a 14-minute body cam video over at Dave at MLS, and he will have a stream later today at 6 p.m. about it. I believe I don't know the content of what he will stream about, but the body cam video is over at his channel. Not in this hearing. This is a competency hearing, so this is just is he able to understand and appreciate the trial. Evidence. This is not an evidentiary hearing.
And you don't know what's going on.
Is that accurate?
That's only partially accurate. Not all seizures involve rolling on the floor or rolling at all or loss of awareness. So I don't think that Dr. Davis gave the defendant a good description that even a person that was higher functioning could understand to give information about whatever these episodes are that are happening to him. I had a very difficult time getting that history. I think Dr. Castillo observed that he had a hard time providing history. He has a very hard time providing history. But if you give him one example of one very small type of event, and he says, "Oh, that's never happened to me," that doesn't rule out
might have been involved.
Seizures. Seizures are classified. There's a new classification system that just came out in 2017. And one of the ways that we distinguish is whether they have awareness during the event or not. So he could have complete awareness and be having a dizzy episode or a deja vu episode or some sort of a feeling that he's falling or actually falling. Any of those could potentially be seizure activity. They could come from any number of neurological disorders, which is why getting a neurological evaluation at some point would be in his best interest.
And in your, whether it's the interview or in your experience with my client, did you find him highly suggestible, or that there's a great deference that he would provide?
Definitely great deference. He makes good eye contact once he decides to look, but he mostly keeps his head down, and culturally, I believe that's out of deference. And he does acquiesce, and I think a good example of that is after he signs the Miranda paperwork, the detective says, "Thank you," and he responds, "You're welcome." And I think that just captures his innocence, and I think in that moment, he likely felt like he had done a good thing. He was responding to someone in a position of authority, in a position of respect, I think with no understanding, clearly no understanding of what the implications of any of that were. But he was being respectful because this is a person that's someone in authority.
And that you see throughout in terms of his inability to understand, or let me rephrase the question. Has it been your experience with dealing with individuals who are intellectually disabled that will try to mask their symptoms?
Often, yes, they either are masking that they don't understand or they actually think they understand.
And then similarly, what you saw with the interview with Indigenous, where he was explaining, my client, that yes, he can speak Spanish. Based on your review, did you see grammatical errors in Spanish in his conversation?
I did, and misunderstandings. And he can get some pretty well put together, small, simple sentences. But again, the key word here is concrete. That I saw a lot more, 75% of the time, you see where the sequencing is off, the timeline is off. It was a nightmare to get the sequence of how he got here to immigration when he crossed the border, then was flown to Kansas, if I understood this correctly, and then a relative from Alabama or Georgia, I can't remember which, came and picked him up in Kansas and took him there, and then he eventually went to Immokalee with the other aunt. That was about 45 minutes to try to get straight because the syntax is all off. He'll say, he went, they went, meaning he went. He won't say, I went. He'll say, they went or they gone. It's all jumbled up and it makes communication very, very difficult.
No further questions.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
If I understand your testimony today, is it your opinion that the defendant meets the legal definition of intellectually disabled?
I believe that he does.
Okay, and that's the two standard deviations below the mean with deficits and adaptive functioning that go in onset before the age of 18. Is that correct?
That's correct. If we were able to measure it, I believe it would be a little bit more than 2 standard deviations below the mean.
And you believe that there is a possibility that he could be restored to competency. There's a chance of that, and an effort to do that would be recommended.
I only agree with half of that statement. I truly do not believe that he's going to be restorable, but I think that an opportunity should be afforded to try to make him restorable, try to get him to competency, and observe how he learns or fails to learn, and maybe get a sense of his strengths and weaknesses along the way.
I want to go back to some of the assessment that you did for some more. As I understand, there are instruments that you would typically use as a neuropsychologist to determine someone's level of intellectual abilities, but you were not able to do that in this particular case because of the language issue. Is that right?
That's correct.
And because those instruments weren't available to you, you did, I think you referred to it as a screening. Is that right?
That's correct.
And there were very specific things that you did to try to assess his intellectual capabilities. In my notes, it appeared that there were, I think, 3 things that you did. I'm not sure if that's correct or if I understood you correctly. Am I somewhat correct that there were basically 3 things that you did to do that screening?
There were several things that I did for that screening, but not for intellectual disability, for neurological deficits, for some sort of deficit in his brain functioning. The sensory perceptual exam and the Luria frontal systems will not necessarily address his intellectual ability. In your question, you said that I said I did this screening for intellectual disability. I did the screening to see if there appear to be deficits in his brain functioning.
Okay. And that would inform your opinion on whether or not he had an intellectual disability, is that right?
Partially, yes.
Okay. So you were describing what the eye movement or screening for eye movement function. Was there a specific name for that screening?
I was examining his visual fields and his extraocular movements.
Okay, can you tell us specifically what is involved in that type of screening?
Yes. When we look at his eye movements, we'll have them, and all of us have had this done whenever we've been to our doctor, or if you've ever had an occasion to go to a neurologist, or you were hit in the head and you went to the emergency room to make sure you didn't have a concussion, where they'll say, watch my pen, and then they'll do movements with it, and they want to see if your eyes can follow it. And then, or they may say a command, look up, look down, they'll have you put your finger to your nose, and then they'll say, cover one eye, and then they'll say, tell me how many fingers I have, tell me how many fingers I have now, or in his case, since numbers are a problem, tell me when you see my fingers, or are my fingers moving, or are they still? So you're assessing their visual fields in each eye. That's one of the measures.
Okay, and you did this screening with him. Can you describe when you did that screening with him where you observed some kind of deficit?
What was the question?
When you did that particular screening that you just described to us, can you kind of explain exactly where in that process you observed a deficit?
Yes, I explained it earlier, I'll explain it again. In both eyes, he could not correctly identify what was going on.
She
in his
did not
lower
like that
left
question.
Visual field.
Okay, can you, I guess I'm not understanding. So because you were putting your hands up and your nose, and now you're describing sort of the lower left area, can you kind of explain exactly what you mean by that's what you noticed that showed deficit?
Yes, let's see. May I draw? Okay. So
this is her, without the words saying, are you stupid, prosecutor? I told you this twice. Let me bring out the drawing. Yeah, yeah.
if this is what, the round part is what we see, this is your upper right quadrant, your lower right quadrant, your upper left quadrant, and your lower left quadrant. So where your left hand is right now, if you're looking at me, you should be able to still see your left hand. That's your lower left quadrant. When I ask you with both eyes, you don't see it, and I ask you to cover one eye, and you don't see it, and I ask you to cover the other eye, and you don't see it, that's consistently showing that you're having problems with that lower left visual field. That's what I observed with him. He's okay with the upper left and the upper right and the lower right. When I ask him to do motor movements to command, so if I ask you, for example, to tell me, point to your nose and then point to your ear. If you have no deficits, you should be able to do that without any difficulty. He made errors on those types of tasks. For some of them, he did them well. It was for one that he failed. I don't think it was a vocabulary problem because I asked the interpreter if there was a word for that body part, and she said that there was, but he missed it both times. I repeated it, and he missed it both times. He wasn't able to do,
Before you move on, there's more questions I want to ask you about that, because I want to be sure I have an understanding of that. So the way I'm visualizing or understanding what you're saying is he has some difficulty in seeing peripheral things, like he's looking straight ahead, but there's an area within what you just showed us that he's not able to actually see something within the visual field. Did I understand that correctly?
or see it clearly. Yes, I think he's not seeing it. I don't know to what extent, but it's consistently the lower left part of his visual field.
Okay, and you were about to go to the next thing that you got to leave. Go ahead.
Sequential hand movements. If I demonstrate a sequence of motor movements, most people that don't have neurological deficits are able to imitate them correctly. He wasn't able to do some of them. He was able to do some, but not others. And he consistently made the same types of errors. Then we have the problem of just observing his features. He doesn't have that I can appreciate dysmorphic features like a genetic disorder. So I'm thinking more of some sort of insult along the way. But he has the eye that turns inward. More percentage of strabismus are due to some sort of insult than to just weak eye muscles. They're both a possibility, but he has all of these different indicators of dysfunction that all hold together very nicely. In the absence of being able to give him an actual instrument, I have to rely on physical deficits or physical deficiencies, something that he's not able to do that most people that don't have a neurological deficit are able to do.
You had mentioned that in the history that was reported, you reported being struck in the head with a machete. Did I understand that correctly?
That, yes, but there's two problems with that. There's a problem with the word machete, something to do with the translation in Mom that a similar sounding word means a long knife, not what we think of as a machete. But there may be a history as a child that he was hit maybe twice with something like a machete.
And you actually did a in-person evaluation of the event, correct?
I did an in-person interview, yes.
And during your evaluation, did you see any injuries to his head area that would be consistent with being hit in the head with a machete, to the extent that someone could suffer brain damage?
Well, there isn't necessarily any evidence that I would have to see on his head that could cause brain damage, because you can have severe brain damage without any evidence on the outside of your head. For example, in a whiplash injury, there's no direct hit to the head, but your head goes forward and then back at such a high speed that your brain bounces in your head. And you have an injury where the brain hits one side of the head, and then when your head goes back, the brain goes back to its original position, but hits the other side of the skull. So you have a coup and a contra coup injury, and you could have absolutely nothing on the outside of your head. So no, I did not see anything that would support an open wound to his head.
You're correct.
That was an interesting cross-examination that, for me, led nowhere, other
In your
than prosecutor
communication,
doesn't
The
understand.
second interview with my client, was there a point when the interpreter got involved and started to explain things further? Or was assisting in explaining?
I don't recall.
And
Can you be more specific?
in terms of some of the topics that you were touching on are nuanced. So were there instances where you're discussing rights, right to trial, or the plea bargain, where he was not understanding the nuance of that issue?
Yes, I recall her saying, and again, it was said by the interpreter on the phone call with his mother that the concept is difficult because there isn't a similar concept in their culture. And I remember asking on the interview appointment when I was at the jail with him, I asked the interpreter if she was understanding him well, or if he seemed to be off in terms of his articulation or his fluency, and he was not. So it's not an issue of articulation like people that can't pronounce their L's or their R's. They make them say, it's really fall, and they use a W sound instead of an R sound. That's an articulation disorder. It's a dysarthria if it happens after an insult like a stroke or a brain injury. Fluency could be a stammering or inability to get, none of that. And I can appreciate that since his language is different. But she did tell us that she had to explain it different ways. And what I can't assess with 100% certainty is that that is only a language issue, because I've done that with other mom and interpreters, and they do understand. If they have an interpreter that's from their area or a dialect that's theirs or very similar to theirs. The literature on the mom language tells us that some of the different dialects, if they're within the same family of one of the 3 families of the 15 mom dialects, the way I understand it, is even though there's some differences, they can understand each other. He subjectively said he understood this lady well, and better than the lady that had interpreted with him before that I wasn't involved with. So I think that likely even the interpreter noticed that it was difficult to get him to understand and to get him to say back. And at one point she said, I'm interpreting exactly what he said, and we would have to change the question, break it down, make it shorter, more simplistic to get pieces of it.
For his understanding.
For his understanding and for me to understand what he was trying to articulate.
And in terms of your experience working with individuals from the MAC community, I understand that the state's saying, or let me not speak for the state, there's an issue saying he's intellectually disabled when there's no specific test. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay. So in the absence of a test for intellectual disability, you've looked at adaptive functioning, you looked at his ability to communicate with the language, and you're still saying that that's an issue. If I could paraphrase that, intellectual disability is an issue that some observation may be able to verify or rule out. Is that fair?
I don't think they'll be able to do either. I think they'll be able to approximate whether they think that's what it looks like, as closely as anyone could without instruments and all of the cultural and language differences.
And then in terms of having something documented before the age of 18, which is what the law requires here, you couldn't have that when there's only 2 years of education. Is that fair? In another country.
I couldn't have it with that, with only 2 years of education and with no records and no collateral information, which is why my second rule out is neurocognitive or something that happened later in his life. Now, even if it was an insult, say that happened when he was 14 or 16, whatever it was, a stroke, or maybe he had seizures, maybe he's had seizures all his life that went unrecognized, and the seizures are what's beaten up his brain such that he can't remember or learn. If all of that was going on after 13 or 14, but before age 18, we would still call it a neurodevelopmental disorder. And if we could test him and his IQ was as low as I suspect it would be if we could test him, then he would meet the criteria for a formal diagnosis and meet the statutory criteria of intellectual disability.
But as we stand today, looking at the criteria before the court, his inability to testify relevantly, his inability to appreciate the charges or understand the adversarial system, you're still saying he's not competent. Is that fair?
Yes, it's fair. I'm recommending that the court not find him competent because he does not meet the statutory criteria.
No further questions.
Anything else? Ms. Winston, excused.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Doctor. You were free to go.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Your Honor, defense calls Mariana Blanco.
Let's take a break. We've been for quite a while. We're allowed the court to have a break, so we'll stand down for 15 minutes.
Thank you.
We skipped ahead. I found her very credible. That's the defendant, by the way, Mr. Mendez. And yeah, I found her credible. She seemed to be able to explain, at least to me and the judge, but not to the prosecutor. So maybe the prosecutor needs to be evaluated as well. But we will hear from more experts.
All right, we're back on the record in case 23 CF 781. Madam Interpreter, are you still with us?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. All right, Ms. Peoples, you may call your next witness.
Good morning, Your Honor. Defense calls Mariana Blanco.
Again, you'll raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So
That's long hair.
let's speak in that microphone. That's your witness.
Your Honor, just a reminder, Ms. Blanco's going to
Hello, gorgeous.
the competency and to the body. Please state your name.
Mariana Blanco, Mariana, last name Blanco.
And where are you employed?
I am the Assistant Executive Director of the Guatemala Maya Center, Inc., known as the GMC or Centro Maya.
And can you, I'm going to call it the GFC. Okay. Can you please explain to Judge Smith what is the GFC?
Yeah, so we are a nonprofit located in Lake Worth in West Palm Beach area. We provide social services, direct services to anybody who really needs it, so translation services, and we do advocacy work.
And what responsibilities do you have at the GMC?
I oversee all of the programs at the GMC. I oversee all of the staff. I make sure that our funding is in order, that our programs are running, do all the new hires, and I would take the high needs cases.
And how long has the GMC been open or functioning?
We have Our founder and executive director, Father Franco Lachlan, he has been doing this work for over 58 years. He was doing this work prior in the Archdiocese as the head of the Migrant and Refugee Services. So he started this work doing that, but we were formally incorporated in 1992.
And how does the GMC assist Guatemalan nationals here in the state of Florida?
Well, we help people from 28 different countries. We help anyone who walks through the door. Our niche are the Indigenous Maya. We have a lot of staff members who are Indigenous Mayan, so we are able to provide interpretation, translation in some of the main languages that we see in our area, being Cancoa, Zacateco, Opti, and Mam. We provide direct services to folks who live in our area. And we have a couple of different educational, medical, and outreach programs.
Now, when did you start working with the GMC?
I got involved with the GMC when I was 15 years old. I have been with them for that amount of time. For over 15 years, I've been doing this work with them.
And how many Guatemalans have you helped?
Formally in my role, probably hundreds. I don't have a definite answer, but we see approximately 16,000 individuals a year in our different programs. That's the amount of people we serve that we can count. And conservatively, I would say about 40% of those individuals are Indigenous Maya. So the people that I would directly work with are probably hundreds.
That are specifically to that Mayan culture?
Correct.
And how many man-speaking individuals have you worked with over the years?
I would say probably hundreds. If in a given year we work with 16,000 individuals, I would say approximately 1,000% of them would be Hmong speakers. And the ones that I would directly work with throughout the time being there are probably a couple hundred.
Now, how did you find out about my client, Aguilar Mendez?
I found out about your client when your office contacted us over the summer.
And in terms of your ability to assist, how have you assisted with this case?
We have been able to, with our interpreter, been able to identify some relatives and translate for your office with some local relatives as well as in home country.
And are your interpreters federal or state qualified?
Our interpreters are not federal or state qualified because we couldn't get the certifications for them, being that a lot of the Indigenous languages are so rare that we have tried, but we have not been successful.
Now, you mentioned some agencies within the GMC. What government agencies actually rely on the GMC for assistance in the community?
We, throughout our 30 years of doing this work, we have worked with a lot of different agencies in assisting in the cultural
Okay, Rosemary Peoples was Aiden Fuchi's attorney. That's interesting. There's I can see that Andrew Branca had an interview with her back in 2022. That will be interesting. If there is an interest, we can watch his interview with her on a later date. So we learn more about Rosemary Peoples.
area. We started off doing prenatal care because our local hospital was completely overwhelmed with premature Indigenous babies in the NICU. So they recruited us because they didn't know how to solve that problem. We've moved away with that in different services. And one of the requests that we typically get now is for cultural competency trainings with the agencies. Sometimes they have services that they offer, but they're not able to get anybody to come, or they haven't been successful in meeting their goals. And that's where we would come in. We would come in and train them and help them be culturally competent to better assist the clients they serve.
So with this cultural competency training, can you name some of the agencies, the government agencies who provide this training?
Yeah, we've assisted a lot of hospitals. Government agencies would include DCF, Victim Services. We also work with agencies such as Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies in doing these trainings.
And how is the Indigenous Mayan culture different?
And particularly in our area, we see a lot of Hispanic, Latino individuals, and there are major differences we've learned in the work that we do with the Indigenous Maya. The first being language barriers, language access. They speak a different language, and so that is a big barrier, but also their mannerisms. The Indigenous Maya are very mild-mannered. They're very passive, and they are not, they don't give information the way that a Hispanic or Latino would typically give that information. So in all of our services, in clinical, educational, or outreach, we have to alter our services to better fit the needs of the culture.
All right, so in terms of then for example, the Indigenous Maya responding to questions? How is it, because sometimes they are speaking Spanish, how is that different from other Latinos?
They are very literal with their answers. They're also very brief with the answers that they give. And one of the things that we do in our trainings with our own staff and with other people is make sure that we never take the first answer as the right answer. We always train people to ask the same question in different ways. And it's kind of you're kind of taking parts of each answer to make sure you're getting the full picture. Our people, the Indigenous Maya people, will be very literal with their answers. And so if you're asking them something, they might refer to yes, no, and questioning some of the things that you're asking might also be seen as disrespectful. So communication can sometimes be difficult.
So my client is from Polo Tenango, Warwick Tenango, Idea Ikaw. What is an Idea Ikaw?
The aldea would be the village or the town that they are from. Ikari is the name of the town or village that he is from, which to our understanding is a rural aldea or village up in the mountains in Tenango, Tenango.
So it's a rural up in the mountains, it's far from the major city then?
It's very far from the main city, which is Guatemala City, which is where all of the services are.
And what's the education in that community like?
Yeah, so from my understanding, school is up to the 6th grade. Schooling up to the 6th grade is free. Anything after that, you have to pay for, which a lot of our Indigenous folks are unable to do. But there are always barriers to that education. One, your aldea has to have a school, and if there's no nearby school, you might not be able to attend that school. But also, if your family relies on you to work at a young age, you might not be able to go to school. So while there is school up to the 6th grade, not everybody can attain it.
All right, so it's free for everyone to the 6th grade.
Correct, up to the 6th grade.
Now, what cultural issues are present with Indigenous Maya and their interactions with law enforcement?
There's a lot of barriers. The first one being that there was a genocide that is very prominent in the community. We refer to it as the silent genocide that started in the 60s, went all the way to the mid 90s. And the bloodiest time of that genocide was in the 80s. That is when a lot of the villages, anywhere from 400 to 600 villages were wiped out. So we saw a lot of exiles. That is really the time where we, as a center, began to see the migration of the families to the area that we are. And the interactions that they would have been with the military. They were executing their families. So there's no real relationship with law enforcement because of the relation to the silent genocide.
All right, so let me interrupt this. What you're describing, it sounds like it was mostly in the 80s, and that would predate my client's birth. So how would that come into a factor with Virgilio?
Yeah, so though he wouldn't have been born during the silent genocide, his parents would have absolutely been affected by the genocide, as well as his grandparents, but it's something that everybody would know about. The fears are still there, the ramifications, and some of his family members might have been exiled at the time, or might have had to flee, or might have been killed by the military there. And just to clarify, the population, the Indigenous folks don't call it the silent genocide. That's a term that scholars use to talk about that period of time. They would know it mainly as the slaughtering of the militias or the killing of the militias or something like that.
Now, in the Indigenous Mayan culture, in dealing with questions, if given an option between A and B, and you ask them to guess, can they give an answer?
Typically not. Typically, Indigenous folks do not guess. We try to stay away from that in our trainings and our talking to individuals. They are very quick to say yes or no to something. So if they didn't know an answer to something, they typically would say yes. Guessing would not be something that they normally do.
And is there an idea or a concept of rights in this culture?
Again, we refer back to the silent genocide. The Indigenous Maya didn't have rights for a really long period of time, and we know that up until this day, there's no real form of government in the villages or aldeas, the towns that they reside in. So there is this form of community policing where the elders and the males in the community will take turns daily and weekly being the police officers or the police force, acting like some sort of government figures, and they will kind of police each other, but they typically live in harmony. So the idea of rights is not something that is common. We in our agency teach rights once they get here because we have recognized that not knowing your rights can get you in a lot of trouble. So that is something that we are always offering so they know how to interact with not just law enforcement, but anybody that that they might interact with.
So anyone with authority, with a doctor, teacher, law enforcement, is part of the teaching then?
Yeah, typically, anyone with higher education would be seen as authority, so teachers would be seen as authority, counselors, doctors, social workers, advocates, law enforcement certainly, and when an Indigenous Maya person is referring to someone that they view as authority, they are likely not going to ask questions, follow-up questions, and they're going to be very brief with the answers that they give.
Now, you have not met with my client, correct?
No.
How can the GNC help with this case in the future?
We can assist in lots of different ways. The first would be direct services. We could assist with housing and that emergency financial assistance for housing. And in the need that there are other services that are needed, such as mental health counseling, we can always make sure that he's receiving the services, if not in person, virtual, and with an interpreter, as well as ensuring that he comes to his court dates and is keeping track with his case.
And so it sounds like room, board, transportation, those are things that the GNC can come alongside and provide for.
Yes.
And where do the funds come for this assistance?
We have emergency housing funds that we have received by one of our donors. Those funds are limited, but we use them for emergency cases. And in this particular case, we have been contacted by a lot of community members and people in different states wanting to donate to Virgilio's case. So we can and are planning on setting up some sort of donation that we can assist with Virgilio with getting the funds.
Just one moment.
Yeah, just for information, in 30 minutes, roughly, it's a Jodi Arias trial. Me and Dave are doing it every Tuesday, every Saturday at noon Eastern Time. Today, jury questions begin. And there's over 100 jury questions for Miss Jodi Arias. So don't miss out on that one. I will continue this hearing on a later date once we switch over. And I will probably do some of the articles that has been written about this and maybe even the actual arrest body cam video. But that will be on a later date because there's a bunch of us law tubers who wants to bring this to a higher, more people needs to know about this case, and whether or not it will be a trial or not, because the political aspects of this trial is what made the charges happen. So the only way for us to recognize it's a political decision is to make awareness of it. And so that's why a bunch of us are starting to cover this case to make it more visible. Thank you, Romeo. Yeah, to make it more visible. But let's finish off her testimony.
No further questions.
Cross-examination. Good morning.
Good morning.
Has your organization ever performed competency training? And let me be very specific because with the questions that were asked you before, I noticed that there was a very specific phrase that was used as cultural competency. And I'm not referring to cultural competency, I'm referring to legal competency. Has your organization ever provided legal competency training to an individual that's been found incompetent to proceed to trial?
No,
Do you have any psychologists on staff?
not in our staff directly, no.
And in what way would you be able to provide competency restoration training to this particular thing?
Our services would be geared on what the court rules, whatever is decided, but we would partner up with other agencies. We have a wide net of agencies that would be able to assist. So our agency doesn't have psychologists or therapists, psychiatrists on board, but we do partner with agencies and collaborate with them, so they would be able to assist with that.
With regard to, there were some questions asked about various services and the conversation about fines. You understand that the defendant is not just simply being held right now on this particular case, but he's also being held on an immigration hold as well, correct?
Yes,
So it would likely not be possible that he would be able to be released to your care. Do you understand that?
correct, yes.
Okay. Even if you were able to provide competency restoration training, it sounds like you've never done that before, but even if you were, are you even equipped to be able to come and do that while he was in custody?
Our agency will support with any direct services. We can support with translation and we can support with the cultural aspects. So we would be guided by this court on what our role would be.
I'm talking about sending somebody, say, to a jail to provide the training. Do you have the capability of even doing that?
Yes,
But you've never done it before?
no.
Correction, we should be able to go through the next witness as well before Jody. So I'm putting up in 1.25.
Ms. Blanco, to be clear, this room, board, and transportation is the ability to come alongside and assist Virgilio, is that correct?
Correct,
You're not here to present that the GMC would provide competency training, but facilitate that for Virgilio.
correct.
And you're aware of his family in Immokalee in South Florida?
Yes,
So if he was released on this case and the detention hold was resolved and he was out, it's my understanding that the GMC would stand in and provide him with housing, transportation, so that if he had to do competency training here in the St. Augustine area, that transportation would be provided, or if the court ordered you to have to stay in St. Augustine, the housing could be provided here in St. Augustine.
that's correct.
You're here to facilitate whatever the court allows for my client.
That's correct.
And in terms of your work in the past, is government agencies reaching out to you to assist with their work with the non-speaking community?
Yes, it's government agencies typically because they don't know how, or they haven't been successful in their goal with the client.
No further questions, James.
All right, thank you, Ms. Would you excuse?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. There you go. Any additional witnesses for the witness? All right.
All right, her testimony is done. Now let's move on to the next one. I wonder who that is. And I think she was good. I mean,
Sir, go raise your right hand. You swear or affirm this?
I think, first of all, I think she's gorgeous. But then again, she reminds me of a girl from Venezuela I dated back in the day. And so I'm kind of biased. Yeah, let's see who the next witness is. What he says. Well, he looks like a doctor of some sort.
That's what you were about to give. Will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. I did. Have a seat. That's that microphone. Speak your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning. Good morning. Relatively morning.
Yes, sir.
Could you please introduce yourself for the record?
Roger Todd Davis.
And how are you employed, sir?
I'm a forensic psychologist.
And how long have you been working as a forensic psychologist?
What was his name? Normal.
Relatively morning.
Yes, sir.
Could you please introduce yourself for the record?
Roger Todd Davis.
And how are you employed, sir?
I'm a forensic psychologist.
And how long have you been working as a forensic psychologist?
Since 1992.
Are you duly licensed in the state of Florida, sir?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about, in the past, when you've been called to testify, what parties you've been called to testify on behalf of?
I do court-ordered evaluations. I'm not sure about a percentage in which party typically calls me.
Whatever your opinions are, depends on who may want you to testify on their behalf.
Yes.
And the bulk of your evaluations are actually court-appointed, it's not on behalf of a particular party, is that right?
Almost all.
Dr. Davis, did you have an opportunity in this particular case, or were you appointed by the court to conduct a competency evaluation of the defendant in this particular case?
Yes.
And did you do that in person?
Yes.
And where did that take place?
In the Volusia County Branch Jail
And on what date?
on August 11th of this year.
How much time did you spend with the defendant?
2.5 hours.
Prior to visiting with him, did you have any records that were provided to you that you reviewed?
I reviewed the arrest report, the court order, and the suggestion of mental incompetence to stand trial. And I also reviewed, inquired about mental health records from the Volusia County Branch Jail. I was informed that there were.
On that respect, have you ever seen, the defense been in jail since May, have you seen any records whatsoever that the defendant suffered any seizures, any type of medical issues such as that?
No, in fact, this morning I called a mental health provider from Volusia County Branch Jail and inquired about that. There's no indication of mental health issues or medical issues such as a seizure.
Okay. Since your evaluation, have you received additional information that you reviewed?
Yes, you provided me with a transcript of an interview the defendant had with the detective the night he was arrested.
And Dr. Davis, can you tell the court when you
Oh, this is Davis.
met with the defendants?
Okay, this is Dr. Davis, who the previous one did previous doctor didn't agree with. Okay, let's see what he has to say.
Can you talk a little bit about what you kind of went over with him initially and how that evaluation progressed from that point forward?
Sure, well, I'll begin by explaining the purpose of the evaluation. One is confidentiality. I should add there was a man speaking interpreter via Zoom. His Peoples was present for the evaluation as well. Also, follow up by trying to get a history, some basic background information, including education, work history, mental health history, which he said he said that he'd never received mental health treatment, either in the community or in the jail. And then you do what's called a mental status examination, when you ask about mental health symptoms. He did not endorse mental health issues such as psychosis, impaired reality testing, hallucinations, delusions, which are fixed false beliefs. Didn't endorse or exhibit any signs of mania. Didn't endorse even experiencing anxiety or depression. So basically didn't endorse experiencing major psychological symptoms.
Did you see anything in his demeanor, not just the spoken word, but anything in his demeanor that indicated to you in any way that he was suffering from any sort of illness?
Right, that's it too. No signs of psychosis, for example. Possible signs of psychosis would be someone's hallucinating. And oftentimes they might exhibit that by maybe trying to whisper to themselves or to focus on a part of the room when no one's sitting. There was no evidence of that. He didn't engage in any other bizarre behavior. Things we got out of someone, evaluate people to get out of the seat and start doing strange things. He didn't do that. He was calm and cooperative in terms of in that manner throughout the evaluation.
Other than sort of telling him who you were, why you were there, sort of preliminary things that you would typically do in a competency evaluation, and then other than also the mental health evaluation, were there other conversations regarding particular topics that you engaged in with your defendants?
Other than the competency, nothing stands out.
Did you ask questions or try to obtain history?
Well, yes.
From where he was from?
Yes.
His family background?
Yeah, I alluded to that, yes.
Okay. And can you tell us a little bit about some of the things he told you about his background?
It was very brief. He said that he was born in, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, but I think I've heard it this morning, Macau, which turns out to be in Guatemala. And then he said that he came to the United States when he was 17 years old. And then he gave some inconsistent information about his education. Initially said that he completed 12 years of high school in Guatemala, but when I questioned him further, he said that he was 12 years old when he dropped out of the 6th grade. And he said his explanation was that he left school to help his family financially, to help them out. He said that he did not attend school since he came to the United States, and he does not have a GED. He said he's primarily worked construction, although when he was arrested for this case, he said he was harvesting crops. He said that he lived with 3 people who he described as his friends. However, he said he didn't know their first names. And as I noted before, he said that he had not received any mental health treatment in any school.
During your time with him, and specifically in terms of the background questions, were you able, I know that you said that you had a mom interpreter there to assist you in communicating with him.
Right.
Were you able to converse with him in a way where you were asking him questions and he was providing you with relevant responses?
Yes. One caveat is that I did have to repeat a number of questions. I wasn't sure what to attribute that to. I've worked with interpreters before, and it has been the case in some situations where I had an interpreter. So I wasn't sure whether to attribute it to that or not. But when we did, if I may add, please, when I did repeat the question, he provided relevant responses after one repetition.
So in terms of your mental health evaluation, can you talk a little bit about that?
That's basically the mental status examination, which is, as we talked about, is questioning about symptoms, but also observing behaviors. And if someone, if I can just add, if someone's incompetent, 2 major ways that they're incompetent would be if they're psychotic and suffer from mania. There were no indications that he had either of those conditions.
In terms of the competency factors,
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about your evaluation in terms of
Basically, he stated he knew very little of what I asked him, including what he was charged with, possible penalties, roles of the major participants in court, pleas that he could enter, or the plea bargaining process. And I educated him about that and questioned him again immediately. And if anything, he performed forward after I gave him the information. He knew more before I provided the information and when I questioned him again.
And did that raise a red flag with you?
Yeah, yes.
And also,
Well, because it's as if he retained absolutely nothing of what I told him, which is, I've done thousands of these evaluations, and it's very uncommon, even for people with an intellectual disability. You would think they would retain, I would expect them to retain some.
can you talk a little bit more in
That's a bit inconsistent, in my opinion. Morning, Danny. I'm not entirely sure where he's getting at. But let's continue.
detail about sort of that evaluation as it proceeded that made you continue to have these red flags?
Well, to give you some examples, when I questioned him about the roles of the participants in court, the police, the plea bargaining process, the only information that he gave correct responses for was that the defendant is a person accused of a crime, and that if a person is committed a crime, is permitted to plead not guilty. And I gave him all the information. I told him what the judge and jury's rules are, told him what a plea bargain was. And I questioned him again, and the only correct information that he provided was the public defender's rule. That was what I was saying before, that he gave fewer correct answers the second time than the first, after I provided him with the information.
What conclusions did you reach as a result of that?
Well, I questioned whether or not he was giving his best effort. And there was another reason that I questioned that, is that he claimed that he didn't know what the not guilty plea was, and I explained it to him. And again, I questioned him again immediately after I provided him with all the information. And he once again said that he didn't know what not guilty meant. However, at another time, when he was asserting his innocence, he spontaneously, according to the translator, used the term not guilty, because he was claiming to be innocent, which suggested that in fact he did know what that term meant. And again, that's another indication, another red flag in terms of, is he providing his best effort?
You heard the testimony of the doctors that testified before you and their opinions in this particular case. What, if any, response do you have concerning the testimony they have provided?
I respect both of them, their opinions. However, I guess the major question I have is, after listening to them, I'm not sure what they did to assess his effort.
And are there ways to do that?
Well, normally we would give tests. I think that people testify to, that's not appropriate with someone from this culture.
She showed
Results
with
would be
pictures
But
stuff
you do
she
things
did.
Like what I try to do is that you educate and you see, all right, after some education, does he perform worse, better, the same? Does he know basic things? If someone claims they don't know something and then sort of slips up and demonstrates that they do, those are sort of things that you do. If you don't have testing, that you sort of look for.
And they obviously attribute that to intellectual disability. In this particular case, what causes you to conclude that it's not because of intellectual disability, but because he's not putting forth this effort?
Well, for a couple of things. One, because I've evaluated a number of people with intellectual disabilities that are at least able to parrot back what you say about competency after you told them 10 minutes earlier. Whether their level of understanding is debatable, but at least they can parrot it back. And he didn't do that for anyone. And again, I think that the fact that he made the mistake in claiming not to know what not guilty was and later demonstrated it. I think the third thing, that in terms of intellectual disability, this is not true of all people, of course, with intellectual disabilities. If he were to have an intellectual disability, he'd be relatively high functioning. By that I mean living independently with friends, and he describes his friends. And he's working. He worked in construction. Harvesting crops. That's true for some people with intellectual disabilities, but many folks with that diagnosis need a lot more support and aren't able to do those things independently. So that's another factor that I consider.
And is this
Sir,
with regard to, for example,
Sir. What's your baseline for that opinion? What? Now, this I want to know. What's your baseline for that opinion? I talked to? No. I mean, as you all know, I'm a union rep. I do labor law. I have represented thousands of workers. probably tens of thousands. There are people out there who barely knows how to speak, but they can work. And then you have people who are amazing at talking, who more or less can't drive a forklift. Yeah, maybe. Davis, it seems like it's the lingering. Now, lingering you might remember from the that we heard trial when they testified about Miss Heard lingering. Here it seems more to me in my I'm not a psychologist, definitely not a forensic psychologist, but it seems like when this doctor tried to explain things to Mr. Mendez, he confused him. So if that was due to bad translation, I don't know, but it seems like he knew less after his explanation. And that's on you, doctor, in my opinion.
The other expert about adaptive functions.
Right.
Is that what you're referring to?
And certainly, activities enabling. Yes, he's able to take care of, feed himself, get himself to the job site. It sounds like he's able to hold jobs. He's able to perform work. He's able to go home and get groceries, and he's able to survive relatively independent.
What about the fact that he is from Guatemala and has come to this country, through a not normal process? Most people in other countries that come here legally would get on a plane or they would drive across the border or whatever,
Right.
and sort of an unconditional way. What perspective do you have with regard to the fact that he's done that?
In some sense, it's pretty impressive for anyone to be able to do that, especially someone if they would have any options.
It would to actually
To navigate all the obstacles that you read about in the newspapers for people to come to this country.
do you have an opinion concerning whether or not the defendant in this particular case has an intellectual disability?
It's hard to prove a negative. It's hard to say definitively that he doesn't. But because of the reasons that I've outlined, I question whether he does. So not without testing.
I need to hear all the cross-examination of this guy and stuff like that, because
Do you have an opinion, Dr. Davis, concerning whether or not the defendant is competent to proceed?
Yes, I do.
And what is your opinion?
I believe he's competent, even though he performed poorly when I questioned him about the legal system. I believe that some of that was due to poor effort. I believe that some of that might also be because he's from another country with a different legal system. He's unfamiliar with our legal system. But that's not a barrier to competency according to the statute. He has the capacity to learn that information. In fact, I've evaluated other people at Volusia County Jail. When competency is a question, they have people from SMA Behavioral Healthcare go into jail and educate them about the legal system. So I believe that he has the capacity, based upon my evaluation, to learn that information and to assist in this.
Do you know if SMA has the ability to provide competency restoration training with someone who speaks the Hmong dialect?
I would imagine they would have to get an interpreter, of course. And I would assume they don't have an interpreter in-house, and they would have to contract with someone.
Thank you, Dr.
okay, cross-examination. This will be interesting. I will not say a word during it.
Good afternoon, Dr. Davis.
Good afternoon, Ms. Peoples. Good afternoon.
Yes. So for competency and an evaluation, fair to say that there's two main areas that you're evaluating: mental health and the other side being intellectual disability. There's two options.
There are two options.
Okay. You did not evaluate for intellectual disability.
I was not asked.
All right. And in terms of an evaluation for mental health, there's those two branches that you talked about: psychotic and mania.
The two most typical ways that people are not.
And you're in agreement with all three doctors that there's no psychopathy, there's no mania present with my client.
There's no psychosis, no mania.
Psychosis. Thank you.
That's okay.
All right, so a moment ago you mentioned that he said that he's not guilty and he understands it because later on he was able to use it correctly.
Right.
So in the same interview, you have one phrase used correctly and then later on incorrectly.
It was later on after I assessed his competency that he just kind of spontaneously asserted his innocence and then used the term, according to the interpreter, used the term not guilty. Or in the context of asserting his innocence.
In the context of this particular case.
Yes.
All right. And in that same interview, there's an instance where he told you he had a 12th grade education versus dropping out in the 12th year. So again, he's using the number 12 and he's not kind of really using it properly.
He was inconsistent, yes.
All right, same interview, same interpreter, same, everyone's the same, but he's using these two numbers different.
Yeah.
And in your interview with him, in terms of getting to work, did he disclose that he was being driven to work?
He didn't disclose that, yeah.
Okay, and did he disclose that he gets to work by the lead of that group of four?
I don't know.
Okay, and did he disclose that how the money is provided to him?
No.
Or how the money is managed for his family from him?
No.
All right, and in terms of food, did he disclose that he was reliant on these other roommates to bring food to him or bring him to the restaurants?
No.
All right, because a moment ago he said he's able to feed himself.
Yes.
All right, so you're just kind of jumping to conclusions that he's going out there buying groceries and cooking his own meal.
I don't know how he purchases the food, obtains the food.
All right, because he didn't tell you that.
No, he didn't.
All right, and then in terms of his travel from his home country in Guatemala here,
Yes.
he didn't walk you through as to what happened, who brought him, who's reliance on.
No.
Okay. So typically, to go from one country to another, you have to get a visa, you go to the airport, you eat, you pack your bags, you do all these, there's a multitude of steps that take place. You didn't talk to him about what he did to come here.
No.
So what did you do?
So if in his journey here, he was fully reliant on others, telling him where to sit, where to eat, where to sleep, where to go, you're not aware of that.
I don't know either way.
Didn't ask.
You know.
So to be clear, your evaluation did not get into intellectual disability.
I was not asked to either.
And you're not a board certified neuropsychologist.
No, I'm not.
Can different cultures have different communication styles?
Sure.
And can a lack of knowledge of the different communication styles impact, or the lack of knowledge of these different cultures impact the ability to effectively communicate?
Say that. Repeat
Yes,
the question.
I will. I apologize.
That's okay.
All right. Can a lack of knowledge of different cultures impact the effectiveness of the communication between two people?
Yes.
And can those different cultures create barriers in effective communication?
Yes.
And when you interviewed my client, you were not aware of certain communications issues with the Indigenous Maya.
Correct.
Fair to say today when you heard Mariana Blanco testify, was the first time you heard about they're not using guessing, or I would say the word hypothetical, but she didn't. That's not something that they would use as a communication style.
Correct.
All right. And that their communication styles to give short answers, even when they don't understand the question.
Yes.
And in your report, I understand you're saying that he's competent, but in your report, you do mention that there's a concern of his factual understanding of the proceedings, correct?
It was poor.
And that he had difficulty understanding your questions, and again, this is through an interpreter.
On some occasions, yes, I repeated questions.
And that he had a poor understanding of the adversary nature of this legal process.
He claimed to, yes.
Okay. And partly because his understanding of the legal process is from Guatemala, not the United States.
I think that is probably one relevant factor. Yes.
Okay. There could be others, but again, you didn't evaluate, you weren't told to do any evaluations for intellectual disability.
I was not.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Redirect. Hang on. This witness be excused. Thank you very much.
Okay, so he only did a partial evaluation and psychosis and stuff like that, but not intellectual disability. So how can we, I mean, there's a lot of factors going into the statutes about competency, and he only evaluated parts of it. And the previous ones evaluated the thing he didn't. Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did what he was supposed to. Yeah. And okay, that was interesting. Let's finish this.
Thank you.
If you have any additional questions. All right. Your argument.
Okay, final arguments.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. With the statute in mind, the question is whether my client is competent. And the court has heard from Dr. Leon and Dr. Castillo and Dr. Dr. Davis a moment ago. And there's consistency with his inability to understand the legal process, the ability to appreciate charges, the adversarial nature of this courtroom and what we do here. Although there's some debate about his ability to manifest courtroom behavior, Dr. Leon said no, or Dr. Leon said yes because he can sit quietly, but Dr. Castillo was more nuanced in explaining that yes, we can't interact with counsel or follow what's going on in the court before him. And then Dr. Davis, who is very clear as to his role was to evaluate for mental illness, and he did not at all do any evaluations into intellectual disability. All three doctors are consistent that he's not psychotic or suffering from psychosis or mania. But even though Dr. Davis
Legal voices
he himself had to
just sent over his audience.
with the adversarial process.
We have maybe 10 minutes late, maybe 10 minutes
With that in mind, Your Honor, I would say
left.
that
Vice is
the information
raid.
that the court has that he is clearly not competent for this courtroom, for this court setting, for this particular case.
Thank
And then
you,
there's the next question,
Jeff.
what to do with it?
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, why is my... Oh, hang on.
Yeah, we
There we
are
go.
at. Yeah, we are at. They have interviewed 3 forensic psychologists, and
Yes.
2 says he's not competent. 1 says he is, but the one who says he is only evaluated for mental illness, not for intellectual disability.
Mm-hmm.
While the previous 2 evaluated more, and yeah, it's really interesting because her cross-examination of the doctor who said this guy is competent was good. So if you should watch only parts of this, it's the interview with Mr. Davis and how he with Dr. Davis, sorry, and how he failed to, because he was not failed. He was only asked to do one part of the evaluation according to the statutes, which was mental illness, not intellectual disability. So the defense is arguing the fact that they are all consistent, but he didn't evaluate all of it. Then they should go with the defense that he is currently not able to stand trial due to intellectual disability.
And we're going to be covering the whole thing tomorrow too. So we're here for the
Yeah.
preview. We're here for the preview. You
Yeah.
saw it here first. You saw it here first on Nicholas Darrow. And make sure you get down there, hit that like button, and subscribe to him. He deserves it.
Yeah, and we are listening to her final argument towards the court, and
What's
then
up, Cat? Hi to the cat. Howdy, cat. What's up?
Yeah, say hello to Mr. Jingles in his Viking helmet and suit, because he is our boss. Yeah, we have just we are going to listen to this one, and then we are all moving over to the Jodi Arias trial in a few minutes for jury questions. It's jury question. They have over 100 questions for Jodi Arias, and I did preview a little bit of it, and oh my God, she's getting slaughtered.
Well, I've got at least 100 questions for her too, but they're none of the questions the jury are going to ask.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, let's do this thing.
Yeah, but let's listen to her final arguments here.
If he is truly intellectually disabled, then yes, you cannot restore an intellectually disabled individual. But we don't know that for sure, and why. The very test materials that we use to do that are not normed for an individual with his language skills. There are tests that are normed for Spanish, for French, clearly for English and a few other languages, but there's no way to use those traditional testing to see if he's intellectually disabled. But if he was found incompetent, the court could instruct him to the least restrictive form of custody that he would receive competency training in the community. And yes, I'm not blind.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Wow.
That's very sweet of you. Thank you so much.
But if the court were to allow the least restrictive, even if he was taken to the, perhaps it would be Chrome, and then there is that potential that he would still get a release and ability to work on this case or work within the community. The GMC identified their ability to come alongside.
GMC is the Mayan Center.
Competency training. It would not be for nothing, so to speak, or elevated, to allow for competency training, because at least then there'd be that opportunity to verify through observation whether or not he's intellectually disabled, or if it is just an issue of the man language and his background. He clearly doesn't understand the court system, the roles of the parties in the court, and his rights. Competency training would allow him to have that education, and it would also allow an opportunity to an observation for other individuals, third-party individuals, to say he's not understanding, and then we could revisit the intellectual disability. I do understand that typically.
I did mention to people that I thought it was very fascinating that
You cannot do that. All of
his language is essentially
We have no recording
based
of
on
information.
metaphors and
You
things
have
like that.
inconsistencies that
Yep,
appear to be based on
and they
language,
answer
whether it's
extremely
numbers,
literal.
sequencing,
They don't
nuance.
really have the
His
concept
reporting
of
social issues
hypotheticals.
is varied and confusing.
And
Is that? 'cause
Yeah,
it's
we use the
disabled?
very
Is
first
that
thing that they
functional?
mentioned. The first expert mentioned the one from Cuba, where they're saying that he can't differentiate between
So I'd ask the
pleading
court,
guilty,
without
being
reactionary,
guilty,
because I know the court
and
anticipates
being accused of,
that.
you
I'd
know,
ask the court,
those things, because there's no differentiation.
place him in the
It's
least
fascinating.
restrictive, meaning his release, and allow for competency training.
oh,
with
pony!
agencies,
Oh,
if need
I
be,
thought
allowing
it
the
was
GMC to assist, not just with transportation,
Sony.
Also with
Or-
other issues that we need for daily living. And to be clear, it's not just that Dr. Davis did not evaluate him for intellectual disability. He didn't do those follow-up questions in terms of how do you eat, how do you get to work. So for him to say that he can do these daily living functions is quite a stretch. And it's without an actual investigation as to how he's actually doing. And rightfully so, because he wasn't there to evaluate him for intellectual disability. His focus was mental illness. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we are now a few minutes late for the Yodi Aries, and we do have, I think that Dave has prepared bingo cards for what words and what questions might be there, including but not limited to. Or
Don't say it.
I'm 2.5 hours out. I can say
I
it.
know. Just don't. I don't want to hear it. That's what I mean. I mean, you can say it, but I don't want to hear it. What's on there?
Is the term "yiz in face" in one of the questions? We don't know, but we do know that it was in trial. We also know, will they ask for the pictures to be shown again, because all of Yodi was entered into evidence, all of it.
We
plain
saw
view.
parts of Jody that you almost got me calling her Yodi. Damn it. We saw parts of Jody that we haven't seen parts of ourselves.
Yep. And for you who don't know, the victim called Jodi Aris his 3-hole wonder. That was his pet name for her. Yeah. So, yeah. So I will be sending you all over. Thank you for showing up on this last few minutes. Everybody needs to hear everything was said here on Jeff's stream tomorrow, was it?
Yep.
Yeah. And
Good. You didn't say butthole. I just didn't want to hear you say butthole. That kind of makes me.
Yeah. Brazilian wax and a lot of things. How the one thing that was so funny was that apparently Travis Alexander did a test on how long it would take a lollipop to dissolve.
Oh God.
Yeah. In Yodi. And yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing good about that trial.
There's amazing things in that trial. It's so entertaining, and the elf prosecutor, a very, very angry dwarf, is yelling all the time, and the defense lawyer is he would make me seem small, and he can't dress, and yeah, the Tootsie Pop reference, yes, burning sensations, yeah. So I'll be sending you all over there now, so we can start it. We are 6 minutes late already. Thank you, Jeff. everybody, go to Jeff
My
tomorrow.
pleasure.
Yeah.
Sorry for being an hour late. I just talked too much.
That's that we have that in common. I should have been done with this about 30 minutes ago, but I talked. Yeah, but here's the outro. I will be sending you all over. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. Subscribe, like, yeah, you know all the things. Okay, bye-bye.